Sometimes life's cruelest moments happen when we're dressed in our finest clothes, waiting for dreams that will never come. At 58, Loretta Vane sat alone on the train platform in her wedding dress, abandoned by a man who decided she wasn't worth the journey west. The folks in Dry Hollow paid her no mind as she clutched her suitcase, thinking this was surely her final heartbreak. Then, a quiet cowboy in a fine coat stepped from the shadows. Silas Creed had come for a shipment, but found something unexpected instead. "I ain't looking for a wife," he told her gently, "but I know what it feels like to be left behind." His offer of shelter would become something far greater across the prairie. But what secret made his proposal worth more than love itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Loretta Vane received Samuel Hartwell's first letter, snow was falling thick outside her boarding house window in Street Louis, and she had just finished mending Mrs. Patterson's best Sunday dress for the third time that month. Her fingers were raw from the cold and constant needlework, but she handled the delicate fabric with the same careful attention she brought to everything in her life, a life that had been lived almost entirely for others. The letter had arrived with the afternoon post, her name written in careful script across cream-colored paper that felt expensive beneath her worn fingertips. Samuel Hartwell of Dry Hollow, Colorado Territory, seeking correspondence with a lady of mature years and gentle disposition. He'd found her name through a mutual acquaintance in Denver, someone who knew of her situation and thought she might welcome a chance at companionship. Loretta had read that first letter 3 times before setting it aside, unsure whether to laugh or cry. At 58, she had long since resigned herself to spinsterhood, to a life measured in small kindnesses and quiet sacrifices. Her mother had passed the previous winter after a lingering illness that had consumed Loretta's savings and what remained of her youth. The boarding house room that had seemed temporary 15 years ago now felt like a prison of faded wallpaper and other people's conversations drifting through thin walls. But Samuel's letters had been different from what she'd expected. He didn't promise passion or romance, things that seemed almost foolish at their age. Instead, he wrote of companionship, of shared meals and quiet evenings, of 2 people who had lived enough to understand the value of simple contentment. His ranch outside Dry Hollow was modest but comfortable, he said, and he was looking for someone to share the sunset years with, someone who understood that the best parts of life often came wrapped in ordinary moments. Through the winter and into spring, their correspondence had grown warmer, more personal. Samuel told her about his small spread, his aging cattle, his hope for a vegetable garden that a woman's touch might bring to life. Loretta found herself sharing things she'd never spoken aloud, her love of reading, her skill with a needle, her dreams of perhaps learning to ride a horse again as she had in her childhood on her father's farm. But it was the photograph she kept in her sewing box that told the real story of why she'd answered Samuel's letters so eagerly. The image was faded now, creased from years of careful handling, showing a young woman holding a baby girl with dark curls and bright eyes. Little Mary had been 5 when the fever took her, old enough to have filled Loretta's small world with laughter and questions and the kind of love that carves permanent hollows in a mother's heart when it's gone. After Mary's death, there had been no marriage proposals, no prospects for the kind of life other women took for granted. Loretta had cared for her ailing father until consumption claimed him, then her mother, through the slow decline of old age and weak lungs. She'd supported them both with her nimble fingers and steady work, sewing for ladies who could afford store-bought dresses but wanted the personal touch of custom alterations. It was respectable work, honest work, but it was work that left little room for dreams. When her mother finally passed last November, Loretta had found herself alone in a way that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. For the first time in decades, her choices were her own to make. Samuel's invitation to visit Dry Hollow to see if they might suit each other for marriage had seemed like a gift from Providence, a chance to write a different ending to a story that had been shaped too long by duty and loss. The journey west had taken 4 days, with changes in Kansas City and Denver that left her travel-worn and anxious. She'd brought her best dress, the blue wool with the pearl buttons that she'd made for herself the Christmas before her mother's final illness. It was the finest thing she owned, and she'd packed it carefully between layers of tissue paper, imagining Samuel's approval when he saw her step off the train. But as the miles rolled past the window and the landscape grew wilder, more foreign, Loretta had found herself wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. What did she really know about Samuel Hartwell beyond his careful penmanship and polite words? What if the kindness in his letters was merely loneliness speaking, and the reality proved disappointing for them both? The train had pulled into Dry Hollow just after noon on a Tuesday that promised to be unseasonably warm for early October. Loretta had watched through the window as the small station came into view, a simple wooden building with a covered platform and a few weathered men waiting in the shade. Her heart had been beating fast as she gathered her carpet bag and checked her appearance one final time in the small mirror she carried. She'd stepped onto the platform with as much dignity as she could manage, her blue dress freshly brushed and her hair pinned beneath her best hat. The conductor had handed down her larger suitcase with a tip of his cap, and then the train had pulled away with a great huffing of steam and grinding of wheels, leaving her standing alone in the sudden quiet. That's when the waiting had begun. An hour passed, then 2, with no sign of Samuel. The station master, a grizzled man with kind eyes, had assured her that sometimes the ranchers ran late, that weather or cattle could delay a man's plans. But as the afternoon shadows grew longer and the other passengers dispersed to their destinations, Loretta had begun to feel the familiar ache of disappointment settling into her chest. By evening, the truth had become unavoidable. A telegram had arrived for her at the station, brief and devastating in its politeness. Samuel had reconsidered their arrangement. He wished her well, but felt their correspondence had perhaps created unrealistic expectations on both sides. He regretted any inconvenience his change of heart might cause. Loretta had read the telegram twice, her hands steady even as her world tilted. She'd folded the paper carefully and placed it in her reticule, then sat down on the bench outside the station to consider her options. She had enough money for a return ticket to St. Louis, but the thought of that room in the boarding house, of explaining to Mrs. Patterson and the other ladies what had brought her back so soon, felt impossible to bear. That's when she'd noticed the man watching her from across the platform. He was tall and lean, with silver threading through dark hair beneath a well-made hat. His coat was fine wool, his boots expensive leather, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of confidence and means. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, grey-blue eyes that held a sadness she recognized, the kind that came from understanding loss too intimately. He'd been standing near a freight wagon loaded with supplies, clearly waiting for something from the train. But his attention kept drifting to where she sat, and she could see him weighing something in his mind. When their eyes met across the dusty platform, he'd touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of polite acknowledgement. Loretta had straightened her shoulders and tried to look less like a woman whose dreams had just crumbled into dust. Whatever pity she might inspire, she was determined to meet it with dignity. She'd faced disappointment before, had buried a child and watched parents fade away. This was just another chapter in a story that seemed destined for quiet endings. But as the sun began to set behind the mountains and the platform emptied except for the 2 of them and the station master preparing to lock up for the night, the stranger had finally approached. His steps were measured, careful, as if he understood that moments like these required a certain delicate handling. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice low and respectful, "I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting here some time. I'm wondering if there's anything I might do to assist." Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the way grief had settled into the corners of his mouth. This was a man who had known sorrow, who understood that life could change in an instant and leave you standing alone in places you'd never planned to be. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she'd replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Just waiting for my ride to arrive." He'd glanced at the telegram in her hands, noting perhaps the way her fingers trembled slightly as she held it. Sometimes folks run into delays out here. Weather, cattle, all manner of things can hold a man up. It was a kindness, that gentle fiction, and Loretta had felt something loosen in her chest. Yes, I'm sure that's it. They'd stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two strangers sharing the weight of unspoken understanding. Then he'd spoken again, his words careful and measured. "I'm Silas Creed. Got a ranch about 10 miles south of town. I came in to pick up some supplies, but I noticed you've been here since the afternoon train. If your ride doesn't show soon, I'd be happy to give you a lift to the hotel in town. No lady should be left stranded at a train station." Loretta had studied his face, searching for signs of improper intention and finding only genuine concern. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Creed. I'm Mrs. Vane, Miss Vane, actually." The correction had come automatically, though it felt strange to claim her unmarried state to a stranger. "Miss Vane," he'd tipped his hat again. "Would you like me to check with the station master? Sometimes messages get delayed." But they both knew no message was coming. Samuel Hartwell had made his choice, and it didn't include a 58-year-old seamstress with more hope than good sense. Loretta had felt the familiar weight of resignation settling over her shoulders like an old, familiar shawl. "Actually, Mr. Creed," she'd said, surprising herself with her directness, "I believe I've been stood up." Silas Creed had heard those words before. "I believe I've been stood up," though never spoken with such quiet dignity. The admission hung in the cooling evening air between them, honest and raw, and he felt something shift in his chest that had been still for too long. He pulled the silver pocket watch from his vest, a habit born of 30 years of marriage to a woman who'd valued punctuality above most virtues. Eleanor had given him the watch on their first anniversary, her initials still visible on the inside cover, though the engraving had worn smooth with time. 6 months had passed since he'd closed her eyes for the final time, 6 months of rattling around their house like a ghost haunting his own life. "Well then," he said, snapping the watch closed and returning it to his pocket, "I reckon that makes two of us who understand something about being disappointed by folks who ought to know better." Loretta looked up at him sharply, perhaps surprised by his candor. Most men would have offered polite sympathy or awkward reassurances. But Silas had learned that grief shared honestly was lighter than grief carried alone, and there was something in this woman's bearing that told him she'd prefer truth to platitudes. "You've been stood up recently, Mr. Creed?" There was a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth, the first hint of humor he'd seen from her. "In a manner of speaking." He gestured toward the empty platform, the gathering dusk. "My wife passed last spring. 30 years we had together, and I keep expecting her to come around the corner, wondering what's taking me so long to get home. Turns out death is the ultimate standing up, if you think about it." It was perhaps too much honesty for a first meeting, but something about this moment, the empty station, the shared disappointment, the way the mountains caught the last light, seemed to call for truth rather than social niceties. Loretta was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with eyes that had clearly seen their share of loss. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said finally. 30 years is a blessing, but I imagine it makes the silence that much harder to bear. You speak like someone who knows. My daughter." The words came soft, almost whispered. "Mary. She was 5 when the fever took her. That was over 20 years ago, but some silences never stop echoing." They stood in that shared understanding, two people who had learned that life could be brutally unfair and wonderfully precious, sometimes in the same breath. The station master emerged from his office, keys jangling, clearly ready to lock up for the night. "Evening, Mr. Creed." the older man called. "Train brought your order in just fine. Loaded it in your wagon already. You folks need anything else before I close up?" "Actually, Pete, this is Miss Vane. She was expecting to be met by someone, but it seems her plans have changed." Silas turned to Loretta. "The hotel in town is decent enough. Clean rooms and good food. I'd be happy to give you a ride there, help you get settled." Loretta hefted her carpet bag, glancing toward the town's few scattered lights visible in the distance. "I don't want to impose on your kindness, Mr. Creed. You've already been more considerate than I had any right to expect. No imposition. Truth is, I've got nowhere pressing to be except an empty house and a cold supper. The company would be welcome." Pete had finished locking up and was heading toward his own horse tied behind the station. "Night, folks. Miss Vane, you're in good hands with Silas here. He's one of the decent ones." As the station master rode off into the gathering darkness, Silas helped Loretta with her luggage, loading it into the wagon alongside his supplies. The evening air carried the scent of sage and approaching autumn, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. It was a lonely sound, but not without its own wild beauty. "I should warn you," Silas said as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. "I'm not much for conversation. Lost the habit, I suppose, these past months. Eleanor always said I was better at listening anyway." "That's a rare quality in a man," Loretta replied, arranging her skirts as he climbed up beside her. "Most folks seem to think silence needs filling, whether they've got anything worthwhile to say or not." Silas clicked to the horses, and they started down the dusty main street of Dry Hollow. The town was small even by frontier standards: a general store, a saloon, a church, and the hotel, all clustered around the main thoroughfare like wagons circled for protection. A few windows glowed with lamplight, and the sound of a piano drifted from the saloon, playing something melancholy and sweet. "Dry Hollow's not much to look at," Silas said, noting how Loretta's gaze took in the modest buildings and dusty streets. "But it's honest country. Folks here tend to mind their own business and help their neighbors when trouble comes calling." "It has a certain character," Loretta agreed. "Different from Street Louis, certainly, but not unpleasant. There's something to be said for a place where you can see the horizon." They rode in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically over the rutted road. Silas found himself stealing glances at his passenger, noting the way she sat straight-backed despite the day's disappointments, the careful mending in her gloves that spoke of both poverty and pride. This was a woman who had learned to make do, to find dignity in small things. "Can I ask," he said finally, "what brought you all the way out here? Family?" Loretta was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, "Correspondence. With a gentleman who invited me to visit, with an eye toward marriage. Samuel Hartwell. Perhaps you know him." Silas did know him, a small-time rancher with more debts than cattle, and a reputation for backing out of agreements when something better came along. The man had been married twice before, both wives leaving him for reasons the town preferred not to discuss too closely. "I know Sam," he said carefully. "Known him to be changeable in his commitments." "I see." Loretta's voice was steady, but he could hear the disappointment she was working to conceal. "Well, perhaps it's for the best. Correspondence can paint a prettier picture than reality sometimes provides. What will you do now?" It was a practical question, but he found himself genuinely caring about the answer. This woman had traveled across half the country on the promise of companionship, only to find herself abandoned at a train station, with evening falling and winter coming. She had to be frightened, though she was far too proud to show it. "I haven't quite decided," she admitted. "I have money for a return ticket to Missouri, but the thought of going back to my old life." She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Well, I suppose that's my problem to solve." They had reached the hotel, a two-story building with a wide porch and clean windows that promised comfort if not luxury. Silas set the brake and climbed down, then came around to help Loretta descend. As his hands steadied her waist, he caught a faint scent of lavender and noticed the careful way she'd pinned her greying hair. Even after a day of travel and disappointment, she maintained a quiet elegance that spoke well of her character. "Miss Vane," he said, surprising himself with his sudden decision, "I've got a proposition for you, if you'll hear it." She looked up at him, wariness flickering in her eyes. "What sort of proposition, Mr. Creed?" "Nothing improper," he said quickly. "It's just that I've got a big house and no one to share it with. My housekeeper, Maria, lives in town with her family, comes out during the day to cook and clean. But the evenings are long and the silence gets heavy. I'm thinking maybe we could help each other out. I'm not sure I understand." Silas pulled out his pocket watch again, more from nervousness than need to check the time. "I'm not looking for a wife," he said carefully. "Lost the only woman I ever wanted to marry. But I reckon we both know how it feels to be left behind, to have plans fall through and find yourself with nowhere to turn. You need a place to stay while you figure out your next step. I could use the company of someone who understands that life doesn't always work out like we planned." Loretta studied his face in the lamplight spilling from the hotel windows. "You're offering me employment? I'm offering you shelter, companionship, someone to share meals with and talk to in the evenings, if you're inclined. In return, maybe you could help me sort through some things that have been piling up since Eleanor passed. Nothing that couldn't wait, but a woman's perspective might be useful." It was an unusual arrangement, certainly not what either of them had planned when they woke up that morning. But as they stood there in the cooling night air, surrounded by the vast silence of the frontier, it felt less like an imposition than a lifeline thrown between two people who had learned that sometimes the best you could do was help each other stay afloat. "Mr. Creed," Loretta said slowly, "that's a very generous offer, but I need you to understand I won't be anyone's charity case. If I accept, it would be as an equal arrangement. I've spent my life earning my keep, and I won't stop now." Silas smiled for the first time since Eleanor's funeral. "Ma'am, after one conversation, I can tell you're not the kind of woman who'd let herself be anyone's charity case. I was hoping we might just be two people helping each other through a difficult time." Loretta looked toward the hotel, then back at him. "When you put it like that, Mr. Creed, I believe I'd like to accept your offer." The Creed Ranch revealed itself gradually in the morning light, unfolding like a well-kept secret as Silas guided the wagon down the winding dirt road. Loretta had spent the night at the hotel, after all, insisting on propriety despite their arrangement, but now, as they approached his home, she began to understand that Silas Creed was a man of considerably more means than his modest manner suggested. The house sat on a gentle rise, overlooking a broad valley where cattle dotted the grassland like dark stones scattered across green felt. It was built of local stone and timber, 2 stories with a wraparound porch that spoke of careful planning and quality workmanship. Mature cottonwoods provided shade, and she could see the neat lines of a kitchen garden behind the house, though it had been left untended and was now overgrown with autumn weeds. "It's beautiful," Loretta said softly, and meant it. After years in cramped city quarters, the spaciousness felt like breathing deeply after holding her breath too long. "Eleanor designed it," Silas replied, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he used whenever he mentioned his late wife. "She had strong opinions about how a house should sit on the land, how the rooms should flow together. Took us 3 years to build it right." As they drew closer, Loretta noticed the small details that spoke of a woman's influence. The careful placement of windows to catch both morning and afternoon light, the wide porch clearly meant for sitting and watching the world go by, the way the front door was painted a warm blue that somehow made the whole structure feel welcoming. On that porch sat a hand-carved rocking chair, its wood weathered to silver grey, but still solid and graceful. It faced west toward the mountains, positioned to catch the last light of day. There was something about its stillness, its patient waiting, that caught at Loretta's heart. "Eleanor's chair," Silas said, following her gaze. Made it for her the second year we were married, when she was carrying our first child. Thought she might like a place to sit and sew baby clothes. His voice grew rough. Lost that baby, and the next two. Never could seem to carry them full term. Loretta felt the familiar ache that came with stories of lost children, the particular sorrow that belonged to women who had held life briefly and had it slip away. I'm sorry. That must have been terribly hard for you both. She used to sit there evenings anyway. Said she liked to watch the sunset paint the mountains. Been empty since she passed. Haven't had the heart to move it, but haven't been able to sit in it either. Before Loretta could respond, the front door opened and a woman emerged, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was perhaps 40, with greying black hair pulled back severely and intelligent dark eyes that immediately assessed Loretta with the frank evaluation of someone accustomed to managing a household. About time you got back. Senor Creed, the woman called in lightly accented English. I was beginning to think you'd decided to spend the night in town. Maria, I'd like you to meet Miss Vane. She'll be staying with us for a while, helping me sort through some of Eleanor's things. Silas climbed down from the wagon and came around to help Loretta. Miss Vane, this is Maria Gonzalez. She keeps this place running and keeps me fed. Don't know what I'd do without her. Maria's expression softened as she took in Loretta's travel-worn dress and carefully maintained dignity. Welcome, señorita. Any friend of Senor Creed is welcome here. She paused, then added more gently, I am sorry for your troubles. Word travels fast in a small town. Loretta felt her cheeks warm, realizing that news of her abandonment at the train station had already made its way through Dry Hollow's gossip network. Thank you. Mr. Creed has been very kind. He is a good man, Maria said firmly, as if defending him against some unspoken criticism, sometimes too good for his own well-being. Come, let me show you inside. You must be tired from your journey. The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior, furnished with pieces that spoke of both comfort and quality. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, flanked by built-in bookcases, filled with well-worn volumes. Comfortable chairs were arranged to take advantage of both the fireplace and the large windows that looked out over the valley. Everything was scrupulously clean, but there was a stillness about the space, as if it were waiting for life to return. The Signora had good taste, Maria said, noticing Loretta's admiring glances. She chose every piece herself, said she wanted a home that would welcome children and grandchildren for generations. The housekeeper's voice grew sad. She never got to see those grandchildren, but she loved this house like they were already running through it. Maria led her upstairs to a guest room that faced east toward the morning sun. It was simply but elegantly furnished, with a brass bed covered in a quilt of intricate piecing, a small writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe that would easily hold her few belongings. I hope this will suit, Maria said. The Signora used this room for her sewing. The light is very good. Loretta set her carpetbag on the bed and looked around. It's lovely. More than I could have hoped for. Senor Creed, he has not been the same since she died, Maria continued, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. He goes through the motions, but his heart is not in it. Maybe having someone else in the house will help him remember how to live instead of just existing. I don't want to intrude on his grief, Loretta said carefully. We barely know each other. Sometimes strangers can help us see things that friends cannot, Maria replied with the wisdom of someone who had observed human nature closely. The Signora, she would not want him to spend his remaining years alone with memories. When they returned downstairs, Silas was standing in the main room, looking somewhat lost, as if he'd forgotten what came next in the routine of hospitality. It occurred to Loretta that he probably hadn't entertained guests since his wife's death, that the social skills that came naturally to couples had atrophied with disuse. If you'd like to freshen up, he said awkwardly, Maria has lunch nearly ready. Nothing fancy, but she's a fine cook. That sounds wonderful, Loretta replied. But first, Perhaps you could show me those things you mentioned needing help with. I'd rather start earning my keep sooner than later." Relief flickered across his features, and she realized he'd been worried she might treat this as a social visit rather than the mutual assistance arrangement they'd agreed upon. He led her to a small office off the main room where papers covered every available surface in what appeared to be organized chaos. Eleanor used to handle the correspondence, the bookkeeping for household expenses. Since she's been gone, I've been letting things pile up. He gestured helplessly at the accumulating paperwork. "I can manage the ranch business well enough, but all this domestic accounting," he trailed off. Loretta moved to the desk and began sorting through the papers, bills from various merchants, correspondence about household matters, receipts that needed filing. It was exactly the kind of work she'd been doing for herself and her aging parents for years. "This isn't so bad," she said, already beginning to see patterns in the chaos. "Just needs organizing. I could have this sorted in a few days." "You don't mind?" "Mr. Creed, I've been managing household accounts since I was 16. This is familiar territory." She looked up at him. "Besides, it will give me something useful to do while I figure out what comes next." For the first time since she'd met him, Silas Creed smiled a genuinely happy smile. "I think this arrangement is going to work out just fine, Miss Vane." 3 weeks into their arrangement, Loretta discovered that Silas Creed was either terrible at mathematics or deliberately hiding the true scope of his wealth. She'd been working through the household accounts each morning after breakfast, creating order from the chaos of unpaid bills and scattered receipts, when she noticed discrepancies that made her pause with her pen halfway to paper. The monthly expenses for a ranch of the size she'd observed should have stretched Silas's apparent income considerably thin. Yet the bank statements she found, tucked beneath a pile of correspondence, showed deposits that dwarfed the household expenditures by a remarkable margin. Either Silas was the most successful cattle rancher in Colorado Territory, or there were other sources of income he hadn't mentioned. She was puzzling over a particularly large deposit notation when Silas himself appeared in the office doorway, a ledger book tucked under his arm and an expression of mild embarrassment on his weathered features. "Miss Vane, I wonder if I might impose on your expertise a bit further." He held up the ledger with the same reluctance another man might display a snake. "I've been trying to balance the books for the ranch operation, but I'm afraid Eleanor always handled the detailed record-keeping. I can manage the day-to-day decisions well enough, but this—" Loretta set down her pen and reached for the ledger. "Of course. What seems to be the trouble?" "Everything," Silas said with a rueful laugh. "I know what I've paid for feed and supplies, know what I've sold cattle for, but getting it all to line up properly in neat columns has been beyond me. My penmanship was never what you'd call elegant, and my arithmetic is purely functional." Loretta opened the ledger and immediately saw the problem. Silas's entries were scattered across pages without any clear system, some written in pencil that had faded, others in ink that had smeared. Numbers were crossed out and corrected, sometimes multiple times. It would have been comical if it wasn't clear how much frustration it had caused him. "This isn't as bad as it looks," she said diplomatically. "You've got all the information here. It just needs organizing. Would you mind if I created a new system, something cleaner?" Relief flooded his face. "You'd do that? I know it's not what we discussed when you agreed to help with the household accounts. Mr. Creed, a ranch is a business like any other. The same principles apply whether you're tracking household expenses or cattle sales." She pulled out a clean ledger from the desk drawer. "Besides, I find there's something satisfying about making numbers behave properly." They spent the next hour working side by side, Silas explaining his various transactions while Loretta created orderly columns and categories. As she worked, she began to grasp the true scale of his operation. The Creed ranch was far larger than she'd initially understood, with cattle scattered across several thousand acres of grazing land and contracts with buyers as far away as Denver and Kansas City. "You've been modest about the size of your holdings," she observed, noting another substantial cattle sale. Silas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Never saw much point in boasting about such things. A man's worth isn't measured by the size of his bank account." "No, but it does explain how you can afford to be so generous with stranded travelers." She looked up from the ledger. "This is a considerable operation, Mr. Creed. You should be proud of what you've built." "Eleanor and I built it together," he corrected. "She had as much to do with our success as I did, maybe more. She understood that treating people fairly and keeping your word meant more than trying to squeeze every last penny from a deal." As Loretta continued organizing the entries, a picture emerged of a man who conducted business with old-fashioned integrity. His cattle commanded premium prices because buyers knew Silas Creed's word was good as gold. His contracts were honored even when market conditions changed in his favor, and he maintained long-term relationships that resulted in steady, reliable income. "Here's something interesting," Loretta said, pointing to a series of entries. "These deposits don't seem to correlate with cattle sales. They're too regular, too precise." Silas grew quiet, and she could see him weighing how much to reveal. "Those are from some investments Eleanor talked me into making years ago. Railroad stock, mostly. She said the frontier was going to shrink, and smart money would follow the rails." Loretta examined the entries more closely. The amounts were substantial and consistent, suggesting a portfolio of significant size. Combined with the ranch income, these investments painted a picture of wealth that put Silas among the most prosperous men in the territory. "She was a wise woman," Loretta said carefully. "These returns are quite impressive." "She always was better with money than I was," Silas admitted. "I think in terms of cattle and grass and weather. She could see the bigger picture, how everything connected." He paused. "That's why I've been letting things slide since she passed. Without her perspective, I feel like I'm flying blind half the time." Loretta set down her pen and looked at him directly. "Mr. Creed, from what I can see here, your business instincts are quite sound. Yes, the record-keeping needs work, but the underlying decisions show good judgment. You're being too hard on yourself." "You really think so?" "I know so. Look at these figures. You've maintained profitability even during a difficult year, kept your workforce employed, honored all your contracts. That doesn't happen by accident." For the first time since she'd known him, Silas looked genuinely pleased with himself. "Eleanor always said I was better at the work than I was at giving myself credit for it." They worked in companionable silence for another hour, Loretta creating clean, organized records, while Silas provided context and explanation. She found herself enjoying the mental challenge of untangling the financial puzzle, and there was something deeply satisfying about bringing order to chaos. "Miss Vane," Silas said as she closed the completed ledger, "I can't thank you enough for this. I've been dreading this work for months, putting it off because it seemed so overwhelming." "It wasn't overwhelming," Loretta replied. "It was just disorganized. Sometimes we make things harder than they need to be by approaching them the wrong way." "Is that philosophy? Or just good sense?" "Both, I think." She smiled. "My father used to say that most problems look smaller once you break them down into manageable pieces." "Your father sounds like a practical man." "He was. Taught me that honest work and clear thinking could solve most difficulties life throws at you." She paused. "Of course, he never had to deal with being abandoned at a train station." Silas laughed, the first truly relaxed sound she'd heard from him. "Well, sometimes life throws us problems that require help from friends." "Is that what we are?" Loretta asked. "Friends? I'd like to think so," Silas said quietly. "It's been a long time since I've had a conversation with someone who understood both the work and the loneliness that comes with it." As they put away the completed ledgers, Loretta reflected on how naturally they'd fallen into this partnership. 3 weeks ago, they'd been strangers sharing mutual disappointment. Now they were collaborating on the intimate details of his business, and it felt as natural as breathing. Whatever this arrangement was becoming, It was something neither of them had expected when they'd first met on that empty train platform. Loretta discovered the letters by accident on a grey November morning when she was searching for additional ledger books in Silas's office. She'd been reaching behind a stack of agricultural journals when her fingers brushed against a bundle tied with string, hidden in the shadows of the bottom shelf like something deliberately forgotten. The return address made her pause. Thomas Creed, Denver, Colorado. The postmark spanned the past 2 years, the most recent dated just 3 months ago. All remained unopened, their seals intact, the paper slightly yellowed with age. She counted 12 letters in total, accumulation of correspondence that spoke of persistence on one end and stubborn silence on the other. She was still holding the bundle when Silas entered the office, carrying his morning coffee and prepared to tackle the day's paperwork. He stopped short when he saw what was in her hands, his face closing off with an expression she'd never seen before, part pain, part anger, and something that might have been shame. "I was looking for another ledger book," Loretta said quickly, setting the letters on the desk. "I didn't mean to pry." "No harm done," Silas replied, but his voice carried a stiffness that hadn't been there moments before. "Just some old correspondence." Loretta glanced at the neat handwriting on the topmost envelope, the careful way the sender had written his father's name and address. "From your son?" Silas's jaw tightened. "Thomas. Lives in Denver now, works for one of the big mining companies. Engineering, I think. Always was good with numbers and machinery." "These are unopened," Loretta observed gently. "Yep." Silas picked up the bundle and moved as if to put it back where she'd found it, then seemed to change his mind. He set it down again, staring at the letters as if they might burst into flames. "Been meaning to read them. Just haven't gotten around to it." Loretta had been managing household correspondence long enough to recognize the careful lie in those words. A man didn't accidentally forget to open 2 years' worth of letters from his only child. This was deliberate avoidance, the kind that grew heavier with each passing day until the weight of it became unbearable. "Perhaps I should leave you to your privacy," she said, moving toward the door. "No, don't go." Silas slumped into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 55 years. "Truth is, I could use someone to talk to about this. Maria's too polite to push, and there's no one else who'd understand." Loretta settled into the chair across from his desk, the same one she'd occupied during their bookkeeping sessions. "What happened between you and Thomas?" Silas was quiet for a long time, absently fingering the string that bound the letters. Stupid argument about Eleanor's medical care. Toward the end, when it was clear she wasn't getting better, Thomas wanted to take her to specialists in Denver, maybe even back east to Boston or Philadelphia. "Thought I was giving up too easy, not fighting hard enough." "And you disagreed?" "I knew my wife." Silas's voice grew rough with remembered pain. "Knew she was tired, that she'd made her peace with dying. She wanted to spend her last months at home, looking at her mountains, sitting in her garden. Thomas couldn't accept that, thought I was being selfish, keeping her here when modern medicine might have saved her." Loretta could see both sides of the argument, a son desperate to save his mother, a husband trying to honor his wife's wishes. "What did you tell him?" "That it was her choice to make, not his." Silas picked up the top letter, turning it over in his hands. "He said I was letting her die, that I didn't love her enough to fight. I said some things back that I shouldn't have." He left for Denver the next day, before Eleanor passed. Missed her funeral. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of family wounds that had been left to fester. Loretta thought of her own regrets, the words she'd never said to her parents, the forgiveness she'd never asked for or offered. "What do you think the letters say?" she asked finally. "Don't know. Could be apologies, could be more accusations, maybe just news about his life that I've missed." Silas set the letter down again. "Part of me's afraid to find out. If they're angry, it'll just confirm what I already know, that I failed him when he needed his father most. If they're kind, that might be worse." Means I've been a stubborn fool for 2 years. Loretta leaned forward slightly. Mr. Creed, may I tell you about my own regrets? He nodded, and she drew a breath before continuing. After Mary died, I blamed my husband. He'd been the one to take her out that rainy day, the one who let her play in puddles and come home with wet clothes. The fever started 3 days later. I told him it was his fault, that his carelessness had killed our child. What did he do? Left. Couldn't bear the weight of my accusation on top of his own grief. I never saw him again. Never got the chance to take back those terrible words, or tell him that I was just looking for someone to blame, because the alternative was accepting that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all. Silas studied her face. Do you still blame him? No. Haven't for years. But he died in a mining accident 5 years later, and I never got to tell him I was sorry. Never got to say that grief makes us cruel sometimes, that I loved him despite the awful things I said. She gestured toward the letters. You still have the chance to hear what your son has to say, to respond, if that's what you choose. Don't let pride rob you of that opportunity. Silas picked up the oldest letter, the one postmarked nearly 2 years ago. His hands shook slightly as he broke the seal and unfolded the pages. Loretta watched his face as he read, saw the way his expression shifted from wariness to surprise, to something that might have been hope. He was writing to tell me about his engagement, Silas said quietly. Girl named Catherine, works as a teacher in Denver. They were married 6 months after Eleanor died. He looked up at Loretta. I missed my son's wedding. What else does he say? Silas read silently for another moment, then, that he was sorry for the things he said before he left, that he knows I loved Eleanor as much as he did, that grief made him say cruel things he didn't mean. His voice cracked slightly. He says he misses me. Loretta felt tears prick her eyes. Perhaps you should read the others. Yes, Silas said, reaching for the second letter. Yes, I think I should. The quilting hoop had been sitting in Eleanor's sewing basket for so long that dust motes danced in the afternoon light, filtering through the upstairs bedroom window. Loretta discovered it while helping Maria with the seasonal cleaning, tucked beneath yards of carefully folded fabric and spools of thread arranged by color. The unfinished quilt stretched across the wooden frame told a story of interrupted dreams, a wedding ring pattern in shades of blue and cream, perhaps intended as a gift for the grandchildren Eleanor would never see. She started this the winter before she got sick, Maria said softly, running her fingers along the precise stitching. Said she wanted to have quilts ready for when Thomas brought children home to visit. Always believed there would be grandbabies eventually. Loretta studied the intricate pattern, recognizing the hours of careful work that had gone into each block. The stitches were tiny, and even the work of someone who took pride in creating beauty that would last generations. It's exquisite. She must have been very skilled, the best I ever saw. Her mother taught her, and her grandmother before that. She used to say that quilts carried the love of the women who made them, that wrapping yourself in one was like being hugged by your ancestors. That evening, after Maria had gone home to her own family and Silas was out checking on the cattle, Loretta found herself drawn back to the sewing room. She'd brought her own needlework basket from street. Louis, habits of a lifetime too strong to break even in her changed circumstances. But tonight, she was looking at Eleanor's unfinished quilt with new eyes. She settled into the chair by the window, carefully lifting the quilting hoop into her lap. The pattern was more complex than anything she'd attempted before, but the foundation was solid. Eleanor had planned well, marked her lines precisely. It would be a matter of following the path already laid out, adding her stitches to another woman's vision. Loretta had been working for perhaps an hour when she heard Silas's boots on the stairs. She looked up as he appeared in the doorway, his hair damp from washing off the day's dust, his expression curious. "Sorry to disturb you," he said. "Saw the lamplight and wanted to make sure everything was all right. Just doing some needlework. I hope you don't mind me using Eleanor's sewing room." Silas stepped into the room, his gaze falling on the quilt in her lap. For a moment his face went very still, and Loretta worried she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Then he moved closer, studying the new stitches she'd added to his wife's work. "You're finishing it," he said quietly. "I hope that's all right. Maria mentioned that Eleanor had started this for future grandchildren. It seemed wrong to let it sit unfinished." She set down her needle. "If it makes you uncomfortable, I can put it away." "No." Silas pulled up a nearby chair, sitting heavily as if his legs had given out. "It's just I haven't been in this room since she died. Haven't been able to bear seeing all her projects left half done. I understand. I can work on this downstairs if you'd prefer. Actually, I'd like to watch, if you don't mind. Eleanor used to say that quilting was like meditation, that there was something peaceful about the rhythm of needle and thread." They sat in comfortable silence while Loretta worked, the only sounds the whisper of thread through fabric and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. The lamplight cast everything in warm gold, making the small room feel separate from the world, suspended in time. "Miss Vane," Silas said eventually, "may I ask you something personal?" Loretta looked up from her stitching. "Of course. Do you ever think about marrying again? I mean, before Samuel Hartwell. Did you ever consider it?" The question caught her off guard, though she realized she'd been half expecting it as the weeks passed and their friendship deepened. "Occasionally. After my mother died, I thought about what it might be like to have a companion again, someone to share the quiet evenings with. But at my age, the opportunities are limited." "Because of your age, or because of your circumstances?" "Both, I suppose. Men my age who are looking for wives generally want someone younger, someone who can still give them children. And men who might consider a woman of 58 are usually looking for a nurse or a housekeeper rather than a true partner." Silas nodded slowly. "That's what Samuel was offering, wasn't it? A practical arrangement rather than a marriage of affection." "I think so, yes. Though his letters suggested he was looking for companionship as well. Perhaps that's why he changed his mind, decided the companionship wasn't worth the obligation." "His loss," Silas said firmly. "Any man who'd judge a woman by her ability to bear children rather than the content of her character is a fool." Loretta felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "That's kind of you to say, but the reality is that most men our age who want to remarry are looking for practical benefits. A cook, a housekeeper, someone to care for them in their dotage. Romance is for the young." "Is it?" Silas leaned forward slightly. "I've been thinking about that lately, about what marriage means at our stage of life. When I married Eleanor, I was 22, and she was 19. We grew up together, learned about love together. But what we had in our later years was different from those early days, deeper, maybe more comfortable. You must miss that terribly." "I do. But I've been wondering if it's possible to find that kind of companionship again, or if it only comes from growing into it slowly over decades." Loretta's needle stilled in her hand. There was something in his voice, a careful quality that suggested these weren't idle philosophical questions. "I think real affection can develop between people who understand each other, who respect each other. Whether that takes 20 years or 20 months probably depends on the people involved." "And what about love? Can that grow between people who meet later in life?" Their eyes met across the small space, and Loretta felt something shift between them, a recognition of feelings that had been growing quietly for weeks. "I think love can surprise us at any age, Mr. Creed. The question is whether we're brave enough to recognize it and wise enough to accept it when it comes." Silas reached across the space between their chairs and gently touched her hand where it rested on the quilt. "Miss Vane, Loretta, I need to tell you something. What I feel for you isn't gratitude for your help around the house, or even just friendship, though it's both of those things. It's something more, something I didn't expect to feel again." Loretta's heart began beating faster, but she didn't pull her hand away. "Silas, I..." "I know it's complicated," he continued. "I know we're both carrying grief, both trying to figure out what comes next. But these past weeks with you here, having someone to talk to, someone who understands, it's made me remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow instead of just getting through today." Before Loretta could respond, they heard the sound of a horse approaching the house at speed. Silas released her hand and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "Rider coming up the road," he said. "At this hour, it's either trouble or urgent news." They made their way downstairs together, Silas grabbing a rifle from the hall closet while Loretta lit additional lamps. The rider turned out to be young Billy from the general store, breathless and excited. "Mr. Creed, sir. Got a telegram for you. Came in on the evening wire. Mr. Patterson said it seemed urgent, asked me to bring it out tonight." Silas took the telegram with hands that trembled slightly. As he read it, his face went pale. "What is it?" Loretta asked. "It's from Thomas. He and his wife are coming for a visit. They'll be here next week." The moment of intimacy between them suddenly felt fragile, threatened by the approach of family complications neither of them had anticipated. Whatever was growing between them would now be tested by the scrutiny of Silas's son and the judgments that might follow. "I should write him back," Silas said quietly. "Let him know about your presence here. Explain the arrangement." "Of course," Loretta agreed, though something cold settled in her stomach. "We wouldn't want them to get the wrong impression." But even as she said it, both of them knew that the impression might not be wrong at all, and that perhaps that was what frightened them most. Thomas Creed arrived on a Tuesday morning in a hired carriage that spoke of city comfort and considerable expense. Loretta watched from the kitchen window as a tall, well-dressed man stepped down and turned to help an elegant woman in a traveling costume of deep green wool. Even from a distance, she could see the family resemblance. Thomas had his father's lean build and steady bearing, though his face carried none of Silas's weathered calm. "They look prosperous," Maria observed, standing beside her at the window. "The signora's dress alone probably cost more than most folks see in a year." Loretta smoothed her own simple brown wool dress, suddenly conscious of the contrast between her modest circumstances and the obvious wealth of their visitors. She'd spent the past week helping Silas prepare for his son's arrival, cleaning guest rooms and planning meals, but she hadn't quite prepared herself for the reality of meeting people who would judge both her presence and her relationship with their father. "Miss Vane." Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face carefully neutral but tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "If you're comfortable with it, I'd like you to meet Thomas and Catherine. I've explained the situation in my return telegram, but you're worried about their reaction," Loretta finished gently. "I understand. Perhaps it would be better if I made myself scarce while you have your reunion." "No." Silas's voice was firm. "You're part of this household now, and I won't have you hiding in the background like you're something to be ashamed of. We'll face whatever comes together." They walked out onto the front porch together, Silas's hand briefly touching her elbow in a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the approaching couple. Thomas's eyes took in everything: his father's obvious comfort with Loretta's presence, the way they stood together with the easy familiarity of people who'd shared meals and conversations and quiet evenings. "Father," Thomas said, his voice carefully polite as he climbed the porch steps. "Son." Silas stepped forward and embraced the younger man, a gesture that seemed to surprise them both with its genuine warmth. "Catherine," he added, turning to the woman, "welcome to the ranch. I'm glad you've finally come to see it." Catherine Creed was perhaps 30, with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of refined beauty that came from good breeding and careful grooming. She smiled as Silas took her hands, but Loretta could see her taking careful inventory of everything around her. "It's beautiful here," Catherine said sincerely. "Thomas has told me so much about the ranch, but seeing it in person is quite different." "And this," Silas said, turning to include Loretta, "is Miss Loretta Vane. I mentioned her in my telegram. She's been helping me sort through some of the business matters I've been neglecting. Thomas's gaze settled on Loretta with an assessment that felt uncomfortably thorough. Miss Vane, father mentioned you've been staying at the ranch. Your father was kind enough to offer me temporary accommodation, Loretta replied, keeping her voice level despite the obvious skepticism in Thomas's tone. I was stranded in town and needed a place to stay while I sorted out my travel arrangements. I see. And how long have you been sorting out these arrangements? The question carried an edge that made Silas stiffen beside her. Thomas, it's quite all right, Loretta interrupted smoothly. It's a reasonable question. I've been here about 6 weeks now, helping your father organize some household accounts and business records. The work has taken longer than initially expected. 6 weeks is quite a long time to be sorting out travel arrangements, Catherine observed, with the kind of tactful directness that suggested good intentions beneath the probing. Before anyone could respond, Maria appeared with a tray of refreshments, providing a momentary distraction that allowed everyone to resettle around the porch furniture. But the underlying tension remained, and Loretta could feel herself being evaluated with every glance, every polite question about her background and circumstances. It was during the afternoon, while Catherine was resting and Loretta was helping Maria prepare dinner, that Thomas cornered his father in the office. Their voices carried through the thin walls, growing heated despite their obvious attempts at discretion. She seems like a perfectly respectable woman, father, but don't you think this arrangement is somewhat unusual? A single woman living in your home, helping with your business affairs? Loretta has been invaluable, Silas replied firmly. The household accounts were in chaos, the ranch books were a mess. She's organized everything, made sense of records that I'd been avoiding for months. But surely you could have hired someone from town for that kind of work, or brought in a proper bookkeeper from Denver. Thomas, what exactly are you suggesting? There was a long pause before Thomas answered, and when he did, his voice was carefully controlled. I'm suggesting that maybe your judgment has been affected by loneliness, that maybe you're not seeing this situation clearly. And what situation is that? A strange woman appears at the train station, claims to have been abandoned by her intended husband, and somehow ends up living in your house and handling your financial affairs. Don't you find that convenient? Loretta felt her face burn with shame and anger. She set down the vegetables she'd been peeling and started toward the door, but Maria caught her arm. Where are you going, señorita? To pack my things. I won't stay where I'm not wanted, where my motives are questioned. You will do no such thing, Maria said firmly. The boy is worried about his father, that is all. He does not know you as we do. But Thomas wasn't finished. His voice rose slightly, carrying more clearly through the house. Father, I've been looking at your financial records, the ones she organized for you. Do you have any idea what you're worth? What does that have to do with anything? You're sitting on a fortune. The railroad investments alone are worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes, and your ranch holdings have tripled in value since the railroad came through. You're one of the wealthiest men in the territory, and you're living like a modest rancher. Silas's voice grew dangerous. Eleanor always said wealth was meant to be used wisely, not flaunted. We lived simply because that's how we chose to live. But don't you see? That makes you a target for exactly this kind of situation. A woman appears out of nowhere, gains access to your home, your business records, your personal affairs. How do you know she didn't arrange the whole thing? How do you know this Samuel Hartwell even exists? The silence that followed was deafening. Loretta felt as if she'd been slapped, the accusation so ugly and unexpected that she couldn't quite process it. She heard Silas's voice, low and furious. That's enough, Thomas. You're talking about a woman who's shown me nothing but kindness and respect, who's asked for nothing beyond simple shelter. Father, please, just consider the possibility. You've been isolated since Mother died, grieving and alone. Wouldn't it be natural for someone to take advantage of that vulnerability? Catherine appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face flushed with embarrassment. Miss Vane, I'm so sorry. Thomas is concerned about his father, but he's expressing it badly. Loretta stood slowly, her dignity the only thing she had left to hold on to. Mrs. Creed, your husband's concerns are understandable, if insulting. But perhaps it would be best if I removed myself from this situation entirely. No, please don't. But Loretta was already moving toward the stairs, her mind made up. Whatever was growing between her and Silas, it couldn't survive this kind of suspicion and mistrust. She'd spent her life earning her way through honesty and hard work, and she wouldn't stay where her character was questioned. As she began packing her few belongings, she could hear Silas and Thomas arguing in earnest now, their voices carrying through the house with the kind of anger that only family could generate. She'd known this was too good to last. This brief period of contentment and possibility. She'd allowed herself to hope for something more, and now she was paying the price for that foolishness. The bank documents Thomas had mentioned were spread across the office desk when she passed by legal papers that revealed the true scope of Silas's wealth, numbers that took her breath away. Railroad stocks, mining investments, property holdings that stretched across 3 territories. Silas Creed wasn't just prosperous, he was genuinely wealthy in a way that put him among the territory's elite. And she was exactly what Thomas suspected, a penniless woman who'd appeared at the right moment and gained access to a fortune that could transform her life completely. No wonder the son was suspicious. No wonder he questioned her motives. The terrible thing was that Thomas wasn't entirely wrong. She had been attracted to Silas's stability and means, had felt grateful for the security he offered. But somewhere along the way, that gratitude had transformed into something deeper, something real. The question was whether anyone would believe that now. The train ticket felt heavier than its thin paper should have, as Loretta tucked it into her reticule. One-way passage to Street Louis, departing Thursday morning at 8:15. She'd purchased it from the station master with money carefully saved from the small allowance. Silas had insisted on paying her despite her protests that room and board were compensation enough. Now it represented her escape route, her retreat from a situation that had become impossible. She finished folding her few dresses into the carpet bag, the same bag that had carried her hopes west just 2 months ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was once again preparing to leave behind dreams that hadn't quite worked out as planned, but this time felt different, more personal. Samuel Hartwell had been a stranger whose rejection stung her pride. Silas Creed's situation involved her heart. Through her bedroom window, she could see him in the pasture below, checking the fence line with the methodical precision she'd come to admire. His movements spoke of a man comfortable with physical labor despite his wealth, someone who found satisfaction in honest work. Even now, with their world falling apart around them, he was tending to his responsibilities. The argument with Thomas had continued long into the previous evening, their voices carrying through the house despite their attempts at discretion. Catherine had tried to mediate, suggesting that perhaps everyone was overreacting, that time and understanding might resolve the situation. But Thomas remained convinced that Loretta was taking advantage of his father's grief and isolation, and Silas had grown increasingly angry at his son's insinuations. "You don't know her," she'd heard Silas say at one point. "You've spent 1 day here, and you think you can judge her character?" "I know what I see," Thomas had replied. "A woman with no resources who's gained access to a wealthy man's home and business affairs. How is that not suspicious?" The conversation had ended with Thomas storming out to the barn and Silas retreating to his office, leaving Catherine to knock softly on Loretta's door and offer awkward apologies for her husband's behavior. "He's not usually like this," Catherine had said. "He's been worried about his father since Eleanor died, afraid that grief might make him vulnerable to people with questionable intentions." "And he's not wrong to be worried," Loretta had replied quietly. "There are women who would take advantage of a man in your father-in-law's position. I simply wish he could see that I'm not one of them. I think he's beginning to realize that," Catherine had offered hopefully. "Give him time." But time was exactly what Loretta couldn't afford. Every day she stayed made the situation worse, made it harder for Silas to reconcile with his son, made her own eventual departure more painful. Better to leave cleanly now, before more damage was done to relationships that mattered more than her own comfort. Maria appeared in the doorway without knocking, her face set in lines of disapproval. "What is this foolishness I hear about you leaving?" "It's not foolishness," Loretta replied, continuing to pack. "It's practical. My presence here is causing problems between Silas and Thomas. The best thing I can do is remove myself from the situation." "And what about Signor Creed? What about his feelings?" Loretta's hands stilled on her packing. "What about them? You think I am blind? You think I have not seen the way he looks at you, the way he has come alive again since you arrived? For 6 months after his wife died, that man was a ghost walking through his own life. You brought him back to the world of the living. Maria, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Maria sat heavily on the bed beside the half-packed carpet bag. "I understand that you are running away because someone questioned your motives, and you are too proud to stay and fight for what you want." The words stung because they held truth. Loretta had spent her life avoiding conflict, accepting disappointment, making do with whatever circumstances offered. When Samuel Hartwell had failed to appear, she'd sat quietly on the platform, rather than demanding answers. When her husband had left after Mary's death, she'd let him go rather than fighting for their marriage. Now she was preparing to run again rather than stand her ground. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "Stay and prove Thomas right? Make Silas choose between his son and a woman he's known for 2 months? I would have you be honest about what you want," Maria replied firmly. "Do you care for him?" The question hung in the air between them, impossible to evade. "Yes," Loretta whispered, "more than I thought possible at my age." "And do you believe he cares for you?" "I thought he did. But now I wonder if Thomas is right, if loneliness and gratitude are being mistaken for something deeper." "You are a fool," Maria said with the bluntness of long friendship. "That man does not know how to pretend feelings he does not have. If he says he cares for you, it is because his heart has told him so." Before Loretta could respond, they heard horses approaching the house at a fast pace. Maria moved to the window and peered out, her expression growing puzzled. "It is Senor Creed and his son riding hard from town. Something has happened." They made their way downstairs to find Silas and Thomas dismounting in obvious agitation. Both men were dusty from hard riding, and there was something in their faces that spoke of urgent news. "What's wrong?" Catherine asked, appearing from the kitchen where she'd been helping with dinner preparations. "We rode into town to send some telegrams," Silas explained, his eyes finding Loretta's face immediately. "Thought I'd check on Samuel Hartwell, see if I could verify his existence for Thomas's peace of mind." "And?" Loretta felt a chill of apprehension. Thomas stepped forward, his earlier hostility replaced by something that might have been embarrassment. "Samuel Hartwell exists all right. He's also wanted by the territorial marshal for fraud. Apparently, he's been corresponding with women across the territory, promising marriage, and then disappearing with whatever money or valuables they brought with them." Loretta felt the world tilt slightly. "What? He never intended to marry you," Silas continued gently. "According to the marshal, his usual practice was to arrange meetings, then rob his intended brides and disappear. The only reason you escaped that fate was because he got word that the law was closing in and decided to run rather than keep your appointment." The implications settled over her slowly. She hadn't been rejected for her age or her modest circumstances. She'd been the intended victim of a con man who'd fled before he could complete his crime. In a strange way, it was almost liberating. Her worth as a woman hadn't been questioned, merely her value as a target. "The marshal wants to talk to you," Thomas added, "as a witness, if he ever goes to trial. But he also said you were lucky. Most of Hartwell's victims lost their life savings." "I didn't bring much money," Loretta said quietly. "I suppose that made me a poor target." Or maybe Providence was looking out for you, Silas suggested. Brought you to where you needed to be, instead of where you thought you were going. Thomas was studying her face with new understanding. Miss Vane, I owe you an apology. I was wrong to question your motives, wrong to assume you were taking advantage of my father's situation. You were protecting your family, Loretta replied. I can't fault you for that. But I can, Silas said firmly. You had no right to make accusations without knowing the facts. Father, please. I was worried about you, afraid that grief had clouded your judgment, but I can see now that your judgment is as sound as it ever was. Thomas looked at Loretta with something approaching respect. You could have taken offense and left immediately. A woman with ulterior motives would have. Instead, you stayed and tried to understand my concerns. Catherine moved to her husband's side. Thomas has been worried that you were isolated out here, vulnerable to people who might take advantage. But what he didn't consider was that you might be capable of recognizing genuine character when you found it. Loretta felt tears threaten for the first time since Thomas's accusations began. I was packing to leave, she admitted. I bought a train ticket back to St. Louis. Why? Silas asked, his voice rough with emotion. Because I thought maybe Thomas was right, that what was between us wasn't real, that I was taking advantage of your loneliness and grief. And now? Loretta looked around at the faces surrounding her, Thomas and Catherine watching with new understanding, Maria hovering in the kitchen doorway with obvious approval, and Silas with his heart clearly visible in his eyes. Now I'm wondering if I was running away from the best thing that's happened to me in 20 years because I was too proud to fight for it. Silas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver in his hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of honest work and genuine grief overcome. Loretta, he said quietly, I need you to know something. What I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude or loneliness or convenience. You've brought light back into my life, made me remember what it means to look forward to tomorrow. If you leave now, you'll be taking my heart with you. The train ticket in her reticule suddenly felt like the most foolish purchase she'd ever made. But for the first time in her adult life, she was being offered the chance to choose love over safety, hope over resignation. Then, I suppose, she said carefully, I should ask the station master about refunding my ticket. 3 days later, Silas Creed stood in front of Murphy's jewelry shop in Dry Hollow with his hat in his hands and his heart beating like a young man's. Through the window, he could see old Murphy examining the ring he'd commissioned, not Eleanor's ring, which remained in its velvet box in his bedroom dresser, but something entirely new, something that belonged only to the future he was hoping to build. The diamond wasn't large by the standards of his wealth, but it was clear and well cut, set in a simple gold band that would suit Loretta's practical nature. Murphy had raised his eyebrows when Silas described what he wanted, but had worked with quiet efficiency to create something worthy of the occasion. She's a lucky woman, Mr. Creed, Murphy said as he wrapped the ring in tissue paper. Word around town is she's brought some life back to that ranch of yours. I'm the lucky one, Silas replied, tucking the small package into his vest pocket. Took me this long to realize it. The walk back to where he'd left his horse felt both endless and too short. For 3 days, since Loretta had decided to stay, they'd been dancing around the conversation they both knew was coming. Thomas and Catherine had extended their visit, perhaps sensing that something momentous was building, and their presence had provided both support and subtle pressure. But this morning, Loretta had mentioned casually that she might take the afternoon train to Denver to look into teaching positions, now that her immediate circumstances were resolved. The comment had struck Silas like a physical blow, the realization that she was still thinking of leaving, still planning a life that didn't include him. That's when he'd known it was time to stop dancing around his feelings and state them plainly. He rode back to the ranch at a pace that made his horse snort with displeasure, arriving to find Loretta on the front porch with her carpet bag at her feet. For a moment, panic seized him. Was she leaving after all? Had he waited too long? "Just going to the train station," she said, noting his expression. "I want to speak with the marshal about this Samuel Hartwell business, and I thought I might inquire about travel to Denver while I'm there." Relief and determination warred in his chest. "I'll drive you." The ride to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Silas could feel the weight of the ring in his pocket, could sense that they were approaching some kind of crossroads that would determine the shape of their future. Beside him, Loretta sat with her usual composed dignity, but he could see the uncertainty in her posture, the way she held herself ready for disappointment. The meeting with Marshal Davidson was brief but illuminating. Samuel Hartwell had been captured in Wyoming territory, caught attempting to swindle another woman out of her inheritance. There would likely be a trial, and Loretta's testimony might be needed, but for now she was simply asked to write out a statement of her experience. "You're fortunate, ma'am," the marshal said as she finished writing. "Most of his victims weren't so lucky. He had quite a system worked out: find lonely women through correspondence, promise them marriage, then rob them of whatever they brought with them." "How many women?" Loretta asked quietly. "Near a dozen that we know of. You would have been just another mark if circumstances hadn't intervened." As they left the marshal's office, Silas could see the weight of that knowledge settling on Loretta's shoulders. She'd come so close to disaster, to being victimized by a man who saw her loneliness as an opportunity for profit. The thought of what might have happened if she'd met Samuel Hartwell as planned made Silas's hands clench into fists. They were approaching the train station when Silas made his decision. He couldn't wait for the perfect moment, couldn't plan the perfect words. If he was going to speak, it had to be now, before she started making inquiries about travel to Denver, before she convinced herself that leaving was her best option. "Loretta," he said, stopping the wagon in front of the station, "before you go in there, I need to say something." She looked at him with those steady grey eyes that had captured his attention from their first meeting. "What is it, Silas?" He climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her down. But instead of releasing her hands, he held them gently in his own. Around them, the usual activity of the train station continued: people waiting for the afternoon arrival, freight being loaded and unloaded. But for Silas, the world had narrowed to just the two of them and the words he needed to say. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because you helped me organize my accounts or because you brought order to my house, and not because I was lonely after Eleanor died. I love you because you're brave and kind and honest, because you make me want to be better than I am, because when I look at you, I see a future worth having." Loretta's eyes widened, but she didn't pull her hands away. "Silas, I know we've only known each other a few months, and I know you have every reason to be cautious about trusting your heart to someone else. But I also know that what I feel for you is real, and I believe what you feel for me is real too." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out the small wrapped package. "This isn't Eleanor's ring," he said carefully. "This is new, meant only for you, for the life we could build together if you're willing to take that chance." The paper fell away to reveal the simple gold band with its clear diamond, and Loretta drew in a sharp breath. "Oh, Silas, marry me, Loretta. Not because it's practical or convenient, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." Loretta stared at the ring in Silas's weathered hands, her throat tight with emotion she'd thought herself too old to feel. Around them, the sounds of the train station faded into background murmur: the conductor calling out destinations, freight wagons rumbling past, conversations of other travelers who had their own journeys to complete. But for her, time seemed suspended in this moment, where everything she'd given up hope of finding was being offered freely, without conditions or reservations. "Silas," she whispered, then found herself unable to continue. The words she needed seemed too large, too precious to trust to her voice. "I know it's sudden," he said, misreading her silence for hesitation. "I know we should probably wait longer, get to know each other better. But I'm 55 years old, and I've learned that life doesn't always give us time for perfect timing. Sometimes you have to grab hold of happiness when it's offered." "It's not that." Loretta managed, her eyes filling with tears that blurred the diamond's sparkle. It's just that I never thought at my age, after everything that's happened, I never thought someone would choose me for love rather than convenience. Silas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his grey-blue eyes, the vulnerability he was allowing her to witness. Loretta, you are the strongest, most gracious woman I've ever known. You've faced disappointment with dignity, helped a grieving man remember how to live, and brought warmth back into a house that had grown cold with sorrow. Any man would be honored to have your love. Before she could respond, the afternoon train whistle sounded in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. The sound seemed to galvanize something in Silas, as if he realized that trains had already played too large a role in their story, bringing her to Dry Hollow, abandoned and heartbroken, threatening now to carry her away to Denver and a future that didn't include him. "The train's coming," he said unnecessarily. "Yes," she agreed, but made no move toward the platform. "Are you going to get on it?" Loretta looked at the ring, then at his face, then at the small crowd gathering to meet the incoming train. Among them, she spotted a familiar figure, Maria, carrying a bundle wrapped in tissue paper and approaching them with a purposeful stride. "Señorita Loretta," Maria called out as she reached them, "I am glad I caught you before the train arrived." "Maria, what are you doing here?" The housekeeper glanced meaningfully at Silas, then at the ring, still resting in his palm. "I came to give you this," she said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a delicate lace mantilla, yellowed with age but still beautiful. "It was my grandmother's wedding veil. She wore it when she married my grandfather in Mexico, and my mother wore it when she married my father. I wore it at my own wedding." Loretta touched the intricate lacework with reverent fingers. "Maria, it's beautiful, but I couldn't." "You could, and you will," Maria said firmly. "If you are going to marry Señor Creed, and you are going to marry him because you are not fool enough to walk away from a good man who loves you, then you will need a proper veil. But it's a family heirloom." "And you are family now," Maria interrupted. "You think I watched you bring my employer back to life? Saw you make him laugh again for the first time in months, and I would not claim you as family? This veil has seen 3 happy marriages. It is time for a 4th. The train pulled into the station with a great hissing of steam and grinding of brakes, but Loretta barely noticed. She was looking at Maria's warm, encouraging face, at Silas's patient, hopeful expression, at the ring that represented not just a proposal, but a promise of partnership between equals. "The conductor is calling for boarding," Silas observed quietly. "I hear him," Loretta replied. "Are you going to Denver?" She took the ring from his palm and slipped it onto her finger, surprised by how perfectly it fit, how right it looked against her work-worn hand. "I think Denver will have to wait. I seem to have more pressing business here in Dry Hollow." The smile that spread across Silas's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes to everything," Loretta said, rising on her toes to kiss him gently. "Yes to marriage, yes to building a life together, yes to taking a chance on love at an age when everyone says such things are foolish." Around them, the other travelers were boarding the train, but a few had stopped to watch the scene unfolding on the platform. An older woman smiled and nudged her husband, pointing at the couple embracing beside the depot. A young cowboy tipped his hat in approval. Even the station master paused in his duties to grin at the obvious happiness radiating from the pair. "Well then," Silas said, holding her close, "I guess we have a wedding to plan." Maria beamed at them both. "I will speak to Father Miguel about the ceremony, and Catherine mentioned she would be honored to help with the arrangements." "Catherine?" Loretta looked surprised. "Señor Thomas's wife. She has been hoping for this outcome since the day they arrived. She says it is about time someone made that stubborn man happy again." As the train pulled away from the station, carrying passengers to destinations unknown, Loretta felt a deep sense of completion. She'd come to Dry Hollow as a woman abandoned, her dreams in tatters. She was staying as a woman chosen, her future bright with possibility. 6 months after their wedding, Loretta Creed stood in the front parlor of what had become known throughout the territory as the Haven House, reviewing the documents that would officially establish their refuge for women in circumstances similar to what hers had been. The deed to the property, a comfortable house on the outskirts of Dry Hollow that Silas had purchased and renovated, lay spread across the desk alongside correspondence from women as far away as California and Texas, all seeking the kind of sanctuary she and Silas were determined to provide. The morning sun streamed through windows that Catherine had helped her select new curtains for, casting everything in warm gold that reminded Loretta daily of how much her life had changed. Through those windows, she could see Silas talking with the construction crew that was adding additional rooms to accommodate more residents. His gestures were animated, his face alive with the kind of purposeful energy that had been missing during his months of widowed isolation. "Mrs. Creed?" The voice belonged to Sarah Mitchell, a young woman who'd arrived 3 weeks ago after fleeing an abusive marriage in Kansas. "The morning post has arrived, and there's a letter for you from Denver." Loretta accepted the envelope with a smile, recognizing Thomas's careful handwriting immediately. Her relationship with her stepson had evolved into genuine friendship over the months since their wedding, built on mutual respect and shared concern for Silas's happiness. Thomas and Catherine visited regularly now, and there was talk of them relocating to Colorado permanently when Thomas's current mining project concluded. She opened the letter to find not only Thomas's usual update on their lives in Denver, but a separate note from Catherine written in her elegant script. Asterisk, "Dearest Loretta, I wanted you to be the first to know that Thomas and I are expecting our first child in late autumn. We're hoping you and Father will consider being godparents, as we can think of no one better suited to guide a child in the values of kindness, integrity, and second chances. The baby will be fortunate indeed to have you as a grandmother." Asterisk. Loretta sank into the nearest chair, the letter trembling in her hands. A grandchild. The dream she'd abandoned after Mary's death, the family legacy she'd thought lost forever, was being offered to her in the most unexpected way. Eleanor's hope for grandbabies to spoil and love would finally be fulfilled, though not in the way anyone had imagined. "Good news, I hope?" Sarah asked, noting Loretta's emotional response. "The very best kind," Loretta replied, wiping tears from her cheeks. "It seems we're going to be grandparents." Sarah's face brightened. Sarah had become something of a surrogate daughter to both Creeds. Her gentle nature and fierce determination to rebuild her life, serving as inspiration to the other women who found their way to Haven House. She managed much of the day-to-day correspondence and helped newcomers adjust to their temporary sanctuary. "Mr. Creed will be so pleased," Sarah said. "He's been working extra hard on the new addition, saying he wants everything perfect for when families start visiting." Through the window, Loretta watched her husband directing the placement of a beam for the expanded dining room. At 56, Silas carried himself with renewed vigor, his step lighter than it had been in the early days of their acquaintance. Marriage had been good to them both, but more than that, this shared project of helping others had given them a sense of purpose that went beyond their individual happiness. The Haven House had been Loretta's idea, born from her own experience of abandonment and the gradual realization of how many women found themselves in similar circumstances. But Silas had embraced the concept with enthusiasm, using his wealth to create something meaningful rather than simply accumulating more possessions they didn't need. "Mrs. Creed?" Another voice interrupted her thoughts, this one belonging to Emma Walsh, a widow who'd arrived 2 days ago after losing her farm to creditors. "I was wondering if you might help me with a letter to my sister in Oregon. I'm not much good with writing, and I want to ask if she might have room for me there." "Of course, Emma. Let's sit down together and work out what you'd like to say." This had become the most rewarding part of Loretta's new life, helping women who felt lost and overwhelmed discover that they had more options than they'd imagined. Some, like Emma, reconnected with family members. Others found employment in nearby towns or started small businesses with microloans that Silas had established through the local bank. A few, like Sarah, chose to stay and help run the Haven House itself. As the afternoon wore on, Loretta found herself reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken. A year ago, she'd been a lonely seamstress in Street Lewis, resigned to a future of quiet solitude. Now she was a wife, stepmother, soon-to-be grandmother, and the co-founder of an institution that was already gaining recognition throughout the territory. When Silas came in for dinner, dust from the construction work still on his clothes, she shared Thomas's news. His whoop of joy could be heard throughout the house, followed by an embrace that lifted her clear off the ground. "Eleanor would have loved this," he said when he finally set her down. "She always said children were life's greatest blessing, and here we are about to be blessed in ways we never expected." "She would have been a wonderful grandmother," Loretta agreed. "I hope I can live up to her example." "You already have," Silas said firmly. "Look around you, this house. These women you're helping, the lives you're changing." Eleanor always believed that wealth was meant to be shared, that blessing others was the best way to honor the gifts we'd been given. She would be so proud of what we've built together. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Loretta marveled at how completely her life had been transformed. The hand-carved rocking chair that had sat empty for months now held Catherine's knitting basket baby clothes, being prepared for the grandchild who would grow up knowing that love could bloom at any age, that second chances were always possible for those brave enough to accept them. "Any regrets?" Silas asked, taking her hand as they watched the last light fade from the western sky. Loretta thought of the train platform where they'd met, the wedding dress that had been packed away with love instead of bitter disappointment, the life of service and partnership that had grown from the ashes of abandoned dreams. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret that it took me 58 years to learn that the best chapters of our lives might be the ones we never expected to write." Silas squeezed her hand gently. "Well then, Mrs. Creed, we'd better make sure the rest of our story is worth the wait." As the first stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky, Loretta smiled and settled more comfortably into her chair. Their story was far from over, and she was finally ready to embrace whatever came next.